Tonight I'm pleased to introduce our panel of distinguished guests who have taken time to be with us for the broadcast. Our first panelist is Martin Lee. Martin Lee is a co-founder and director of Project CBD activist journalist, an author who has published a number of works including Smoke Signals, A Social History of Marijuana, Medical, Recreational, and Scientific. Tonight, Martin will be speaking on his entitled CBD and Cannabis Health Revolution. Martin, thanks for being here. Next on our panelist, we have the Reverend Dr. Kimron DeCesar, who's a Taoist and is practicing herbalist, chemist, and minister for 4 decades. Recently retired from UC Davis Department of Chemistry, Reverend Dr. Kimron DeCesar will be sharing with us the pharmacognosy and cannabis-based terpenoids, medical remedies, the relationship between herbal and chemical physiological actions. Thank you so much for being here, Reverend. And just arrived, happy to see her, is our third panelist, Mara Gordon. Mara Gordon, cannabis, alchemist, and process engineer with Aunt Zelda's Incorporated in the San Francisco Bay Area. She brings her passions together, integrated medicine and data. Tonight, Mara will be speaking on her work entitled Senior Population Alternative Choice. Mara, also thanks for being here tonight. And our fourth panelist tonight is Dr. Minahan. Dr. Minahan is the Director of Emergency Medicine residency and attending physician at one of the busiest trauma centers in Southern California. Board certified in emergency medicine, Dr. Minahan has been practicing for over 15 years. Dr. Minahan was a big adversary of the movement just over a year ago and now is a full-fledged champion of medical cannabis. Dr. Minahan was sharing with us ER doctor's perspective on what a lot of docs think when they hear medical marijuana. Dr. Minahan, it's also a pleasure to have you here tonight. Our fifth, the father of Jaden David, the first parent to use CBD for epilepsy in the world, the man that started the movement of the parents for CBD, Jason David. Tonight, Jason will be sharing his experiences with cannabis, dosing, and how to get started. Jason, we're glad to have you on the show tonight. For tonight's topics, the format is fully open. I encourage the panelists to ask questions where they feel appropriate. Audience will give you a chance to ask questions at the end. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Martin Lee and let you continue.
Well, what's interesting, we've just gotten data on all these products. When I say we, I'm referring to Fred Gardner and I. Fred is the editor of O'Shaughnessy's, an important publication on medicinal cannabis. He's the co-founder of Project CBD. And it turns out that in each of the cases of the children who are being administered the Epidiolex, or whether they're taking Charlotte's Web or an ACDC concentrate, the results are the same. It seems about 15 to 20% in each case have this remarkable turnaround where the seizures almost disappear, like in the case of young Charlotte with Charlotte's Web. And there's another 50, 60% that have clear positive benefits from the exposure to CBD. And then there's a certain percentage that have no response at all, unfortunately. But what's interesting is that the numbers are the same for each of those products. And that's news that is just being reported now. Now, when we first launched Project CBD, more than 4 years ago, at the time there was very little awareness of cannabidiol, even within the medical marijuana community. And a major point that we always was making was, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive component of cannabis, it's not the only game in town. And we had to make that point over and over again in the beginning. These days, we're inundated with emails and queries, and we have to make the point, CBD is not the only game in town. There's other components of the plant that are very important, including the relationship between THC and CBD. It's ironic. Oftentimes people are contacting us, they want to get a CBD, but they don't want no THC at all. How can they get this? Well, it doesn't occur in the natural world, unfortunately. So we tell them, well, you may not need to get that. Maybe you can try a product like ACDC, which is the most accessible of all that I mentioned. But there are, in cannabis, over 100 cannabinoids, a category of compounds that include CBD and THC. There's also other medicinal components in the plant, such as the terpenes, which give cannabis its unique smell. There's also flavonoids in cannabis. Some flavonoids occur only in cannabis and no place else in the natural world. Flavonoids are what makes blueberry skin blue, strawberry skin red, and it has very important health positive effects. So with flavonoids, terpenes, cannabinoids, and other components of the plant, each of these components are being looked at by scientists, and they identify specific therapeutic components or attributes of these specific components of the plant. But what's important is that they combine synergistically, holistically, to confer what scientists refer to as an entourage effect, so that the therapeutic impact of the whole plant is more than the sum of its parts, and that's very, very important. I mentioned scientists have coined the phrase entourage effect, and I think one of the distortions that has been prevalent because of the drug war is that somehow there hasn't been enough science to figure out whether cannabis really is a medicine. The verdict is out. People are reporting this and that. They're claiming benefits for a lot of different conditions, but the science isn't there yet to confirm this. And in point of fact, there's been an enormous amount of scientific research focusing on CBD, THC, and other aspects of cannabis, but largely it's been preclinical, meaning it's been research focusing on animals, with test tubes, petri dishes, and so forth, but relatively little clinical research focused on human subjects. There's been some, but not as much as the preclinical research. What I'm going to do very quickly in the allotted time that I have, I've been asked to speak for less than 20 minutes, is to run through some slides very quickly about that underscore some of the what scientists have been learning in recent years about CBD, and we would go to these conferences and we hear just amazing things were being reported, and year after year, CBD would emerge as the star of the show. I mean, we were learning all sorts of things that were blowing my mind, for lack of a better word, such as that the receptors in the brain that respond pharmacologically to cannabis actually regulate and control the production of new stem cells, new brain cells in adult mammals. And not just the production of these cells, but then the migration of these cells, because they're undifferentiated stem cells. Again, astonishing things were reported. I mentioned before about how the cannabinoid receptors in the brain regulate the process of the creation of new brain cells. That in itself is astonishing, that adult mammals create new brain cells. This flies in the face of what was considered orthodox science not much more than 25 years ago. It was thought, you've got brain cells, if they die, that's it, But now there's a new concept of plasticity or neuroplasticity, how the brain is plastic, it can respond to traumatic injuries, and it's the cannabinoid receptors that govern that response. So that alone is, it's astonishing. But we would hear, revelation after revelation, and we would scratch our head, and particularly about CBD. I had no idea what it was all about. But this particular compound in cannabis, non-psychoactive, what they were reporting that it did, and I'm going to run through that in the PowerPoint real quick, some of the things that we would learn at these conferences. When Fred and I would hear this stuff, we'd say to each other, wow, this is amazing. I wish we can get our hands on some of this. But there was no CBD around in the strains that were available in the medical marijuana community, at least not that we knew of, because the CBD had been inadvertently bred out of the strains, not intentionally. And the idea was that the breeders wanted to create strains that had strong euphoric properties that got people really high. That's what the market wanted. That's what people were looking for when they reached for cannabis. And without knowing, they in the breeding process, sort of the CBD fell by the wayside. It was made recessive. But then in 2009 actually, initially it was the Steep Hill Labs that discovered a few CBD-rich strains. We're necessarily looking for it, but they popped up. And that was a great revelation. And at the time, Fred and I knew some of the fellows that started that lab, and also Steve D'Angelo at Harborside with backing this project played a very important role in these early discoveries.
Mr. Martin Lee, I was going to ask you a question. You know, the last time we received cannabinoids in our system is when we were born through mother's breast milk, correct?
Yeah.
So what I've been reading, I do a lot of research, and I've noticed that we have an endocannabinoid deficiency. And I think that we're deficient of cannabinoids because we don't receive it since we're at birth. And some children right now aren't even breastfed anymore. They're given Similac from right when they're born. They say the mother doesn't latch on, they give them Similac, and right away they're not getting the nutrients and everything they really need that was put on earth for a reason. So what I see with that, it causes a lot of different of the issues. It starts from there, with a lack of not just breastfeeding, but there's also other different things, but we're not getting the cannabinoids from when we're born to build our immune system and how our brain works. But not just that, it's also, if you look at autism and epilepsy and a lot of other disorders, it all comes from the autoimmune system. And what I notice about cannabis and CBD, it helps out the autoimmune system amazingly. There's much more vitamin C and vitamin E in a marijuana plant than a lot of other plants that are out there, which a lot of people don't even know that. This plant has been amazing for us, but I think the big point too is that we're missing some of these cannabinoids, and that's why our bodies needs them. You know, God put these different plants on earth for a reason, and we're not using them, we're not utilizing them. You know.
Well, every mammal, in fact, every animal with a spinal cord has what's called an endocannabinoid system, meaning we have receptors in our brain and our body, throughout our brain and body, that respond when certain chemical compounds bind to these receptors. They can come from a plant, cannabis, but we also make our own cannabinoids, endocannabinoids within our body. But over time, we can, we're each born with certain makeup, biophysical makeup, and depending on the genes that encode different aspects of the endocannabinoid system, genes will encode these receptors in the brain. And if there's something funny about those genes, that if there's an unusual amino acid sequence, a kind of a double where it's supposed to be a single, there could be a problem, a kind of a mutation with how the endocannabinoids, our own endocannabinoid system is working. And it might mean some people have a kind of a lower baseline level of cannabinoids, and they might be more prone to illness. That's called a weak constitution, you know. And because we go through life accumulating stress, exposure to toxins, all kinds of stress, dog-eat-dog stress, bad relationship stress, environmental pollution stress. Any kind of stressor will ultimately serve to weaken and deplete our endocannabinoid system. So as we age and we go through life accumulating stress, we get weaker health-wise and we get more vulnerable to disease. And it's a natural process, you might say. As a person ages, their cannabinoid tone weakens. That's what aging essentially is. And there's ways to augment one's endocannabinoid tone, to strengthen it. Cannabis is a very, very efficient way of doing that. So is proper diet, exercise, acupuncture, massage, and all the holistic therapies, it turns out, are mediated by the same cannabinoid receptors that cannabis plugs into. Acupuncture, for example, are mediated by the same receptors that THC activates. And so there's many ways to enhance our health, to enhance our cannabinoid system. And we all, come into this world with sort of different packages.
I'm Reverend Dr. Kimron DeCesar. I'm Chief Research Officer at Steep Hill Haylant Cannabis Analytics Lab. Recently retired after 30 years teaching laboratory chemistry at UC Davis. My expertise, as mentioned, which I've been doing for 40 years, is herbalism, chemistry, and I'm actually medically trained from the U.S. Navy, from my Navy days. If you don't mind, I'm going to come over this way to talk. First thing I want to tell you, which a lot of people don't like to hear in the cannabis community, is cannabis is not magical. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. It's behaving the way we expect all sorts of terpenoid plants to act. Okay? It's doing what we expect it to do. Once you understand that, then what you understand, or begin to understand, is something that makes this a little easier. There are different classes of chemical compounds, okay, in different plants and ones that are synthesized. You have alkaloids, you have terpenoids, you have all these different groups. The general groups have different properties. Some groups have a large, broad spectrum of properties and very gregarious, in-your-face kind of responses when you take them. Let's face it, that's the way LSD is, right? okay? You have things like terpenoids, which have very subtle responses. One of the good things about terpenoids is that terpenoids as a group, they have subtle effects, number one. That's one thing that's very common to them. And the vast majority of them follow this set of properties, which is not true of all chemical classes that are used for drugs. One of the properties that's most important follows the rule, do no harm, for every herbalist, every physician, every pharmacist, every healer, okay? And it turns out that as a general rule, terpenoids are very low in toxicity. That's unusual to find allergic reactions or intolerances. A couple examples of toxicity would be, if we're familiar with LD50, lethal dose 50, that would be the amount of a pure drug that you would have to take in order to have a 50% probability of dropping dead from it, overdose, okay? Now, if that's limonene, a terpene that comes from orange rind, for a 175-pound male, you have to eat 456 grams a pound to have a 50% chance of overdosing. Certainly there's a lot of drugs you know that take a tremendous amount less, right? In the case of THC and the cannabinoids, as we find those, they're in that same group. That group is usually somewhere between 200 grams for a person at 175 pounds, 200 to 500 grams. With THC, we think it's about 250 grams. So what does this mean? Well, this means if somebody decides they want to do away with themselves and they make the mistake of using pure THC, they have a 50-50 chance that they eat about a half a pound. Okay? Now, let me tell you why they never die from THC. After they get through that first gram, that first 1,000 milligrams, they're taking a nap for about 24 to 36 hours. And then if they want to get up and try it again, they can. It's usually not too successful. Okay? So, terpenoids is a general rule. This group of compounds, terpenoids, they have low toxicity. They tend to be immunomodulating, which is when we talk about immunosuppression, immunostimulation, immunoprotective. These all fall in that category. They tend to not like bacteria, fungus, tumor cells. They downregulate excessive scar tissue formation. They want cells to be normal, and they don't like invaders coming in. And now we're starting to realize that to some extent we're doing research for its effect on viruses like AIDS. We're doing research on certain types of parasitic protozoans, like from malaria, because it doesn't like invaders, okay? So, terpenoids, big group, large group. Within that group, there are subfamilies. Cannabinoids is one of those subfamilies. Terpenes is one of those subfamilies. The sesquiterpene lactones that you may or may not hear about, you probably never heard of them before for most of you, that's a huge group of medicinal drugs. Okay, very important group. If you just type that word into Wikipedia and try to get a list or something, you'll be surprised at how many compounds you see on there. Now, one big difference between terpenoids and alkaloids, for instance, is the subtlety of almost everything that occurs. If you take a psychoactive like mescaline, you know, it's orders of magnitude more aggressive in the effect it has than, say, the psychoactivity from THC. The stimulation effect from THC, okay? The stimulation effect is a mild energetic effect. It's a natural effect with THC. What you notice in the alkaloid department, you have cocaine, you have alkaloids like amphetamines, caffeine, taurine, you find in yerba mate, much more aggressive effects. The side effects are also worse. The amount of people with allergies or intolerances is normally higher. So, terpenoids are a relatively safe group to use, but it has a narrow spectrum of treatment options in terms of what you can use it for. One of the things to also notice about the terpenoids in this form is we're not using it as a drug, we're using it as an herbal blend or a complex chemical matrix, right? We have a whole lot of chemicals in there. That means the philosophy for treatment is different. Instead of finding one pure compound that has a limited number of things that you're treating, you have a broad spectrum of chemicals that has a large range of things that you're treating at the same time. Okay? That's a different philosophy, because part of the philosophy in allopathy and homeopathy is that you don't give anything you don't absolutely need because you don't want to do harm. Okay? Now, the difference is that when you have a pure compound, it tends to knock your system out of balance. That's why you have more side effects. Whereas what we notice with the endocannabinoid system, which is really quite remarkable, is it's what they call a homeostatic system. Everything's flowing towards this high level of equilibrium, And what happens is if somebody gets knocked out of balance this way, there's something down there ready to go to shove it back in the other way. If it bounces out this way, it brings it back. The other thing with a homeostatic system is there's all these other compounds that either directly improve the specific effect you want or indirectly support it, which I'll talk about. You mentioned AC/DC. That happens to be one of my favorites of the high CBD strains. Part of the reason is it's a very, very stable strain. A very stable strain. Cannatonic C6, unfortunately, has lots of problems. It keeps back regulating or backing into other phenotypes as you clone it and grow it out over time. AC/DC always has somewhere in the 17:1 to 28:1 ratio of CBDA to THCA. And you notice that here's the THCA right here. Here's the CBDA, right? THC, CBD. Now, notice a couple more really important things with AC/DC. We have a lot of myrcene, okay? Myrcene is very important for a lot of things in the body as an entourage. First off, it has a lot of the same effects. Being a terpene and being a member of the terpenoid family, it does a lot of the same things that we attribute to THC and CBD, okay? But it does something else very, very special, which some of the cannabinoids do, and certain other terpenes do, just not as well as myrcene. And what that is one of the ways that the entourage helps indirectly is you have a partition between, say, the blood and the brain, and you have to get it from one spot to the next. Myrcene lowers the resistance of the partition, allowing more of the chemical to flow into the brain cell where it can get to the CB1 receptor. Okay? So, what happens is there's actually an example that you can do on a recreational level if you want. That is, you take one of these strains that when you smoke it, it's what they call a creeper weed. It takes 5–10 minutes to kick in. Try eating a half of a ripe mango, half to a full ripe mango, about 45 minutes to an hour before, so you have myrcene already in your bloodstream. And what happens is that creeper weed doesn't take 5 or 10 minutes. It goes into your bloodstream and into your brain immediately, okay? So it helps regulate that. Another very important compound, doesn't happen to be on here, which is kind of sad, is beta-caryophyllene. You find beta-caryophyllene in things like black pepper. You find it in Thai basil, a number of places. It's certainly a major component in hops, essential oil. It makes about 20%. What's important about beta-caryophyllene? Well, we now know, as of some research recently published, that it does the same thing to the CB2 receptor for CBD, which tells me that if you want to get CBD to go in the CB2 receptor more effectively, by having beta-caryophyllene in the entourage, you improve its uptake, because that's what it does, okay? Now, it turns out that one thing I don't show on here, this is an older report, we have newer ones with other things, is there's a twin. There's a lot of twins and cousins in these isomers, whether it's cannabinoids, terpenes. There's a twin to beta-caryophyllene. You know it as humulene. Its real chemical name is alpha-caryophyllene. See, they're twins. And they both work the same way. Notice that every single one of these that you see up here doesn't like bacteria. Some of them, like limonene, also don't like fungus, very aggressively so. They tend to be anti-cancer, right? And at least 3 of these, the pinene, myrcene, and limonene, actually manipulate the psychoactivity. So they're taking the THC and changing the high to give a different personality. Now, you've noticed this by going to different strains. You go to something like Jack Hare or Super Silver Haze, you get a very energetic high. You get a very clear-headed high. It's very clear-headed, and you're very project-oriented. Wonderful to use for people with ADHD to get them to get work done. If you're smoking Super Silver Haze or Jack Hare, you're not sitting there doing video games. You're not sitting there doing a jigsaw puzzle. You might be painting the car. You might be out running a marathon, right? These are the sort of things you're doing. You're project-oriented, and you're very focused on it. So that's some of the things. One more thing, by the way, that myrcene does, which is really interesting for a lot of other reasons, is that when it's working with THC, if it's in a very, very small concentration, it doesn't do anything to the energetic effect. It's still there. But in high concentration, it flips that and makes it couch locky. It's not CBD or CBN that causes couch lock. As best as we know from all the studies we've done, it's myrcene. And I'll show you some slides in a little while that'll explain that to you a little better, give you a better example. Basically, the rule of thumb that we see in the lab when we compare it to the patients that I work with and other people work with is if the myrcene content on a lab report is less than 0.4%, it doesn't flip the energy and make it couch locky. But starting about 0.5% and working up, it gets progressively more couch locky. So something that has 0.5% myrcene is slightly couch locky. Something like OG Kush, which I'm sure a lot of these folks out here know, is very couch locky. Of course, it also has about 1.5% myrcene in it. Blue Dream runs 1.5, 1.75%. That has a very sort of slowed down effect as well, right? This tells you something else. Unfortunately, this means that when you want an energetic strain or you want a relaxed couch lock strain for night, using the words sativa and indica no longer have any medical validity. They have none. And the reason is that way back when we had only 50 land races and man hadn't started goofing with them, all the sativas had low myrcene. All the indicas had high myrcene. We're up to over 3,000 strains, and most of those are a cross, or not most, but a quarter of those are a cross between Neville's Haze